I'm wanting to introduce now Alf Webster's grandson, Robin Webster, who, this is a clearly an extremely talented family. Robin Webster was a very distinguished architect. Amongst his many designs was an unbuilt project for a Parliament House, or parliamentary offices and administrative building for Westminster, which, had it been built in the 1970s, would have undoubtedly been one of Britain's great post-war buildings. A magnificent design with an internal piazza with trees and public space. And unfortunately, because of the oil crisis, that particular project didn't happen. But Robin designed many other things, ranging from houses to hospitals, all of which are distinguished by their fine attention to detail and show evidence of his hero, or one of his heroes, Mies van der Rohe, as a precedent. Robin, above all, is a great architectural educator. And in the late 1990s, I had the privilege of working with him at the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen for 2 years, where he was Professor of Architecture. And of course, he was honored for his great services to architectural education. But eminent people don't retire, and Robin continues to practice with Cameron Webster Architects, which also involves his daughter. And he's a significant individual on the Glasgow architectural heritage scene, working for the Glasgow City Heritage Trust, the Alexander Thomson Society, and many other public amenity groups. So a truly great gentleman, and also, from my own personal experience, an extremely kind and humane person. He's going to talk today partly about Alf Webster, but to a large extent about Alf's son, Robin's father, Gordon Webster, and their work at Dovecote Studios. So please welcome Professor Robin Webster.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Gee. Well, welcome everybody here. I'm really honored, actually, to see so many people here to recognize the centenary of my grandfather's death. I know my father would have been very, very pleased that he was being recognized in this way. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah? Good. What I'm going to do is I'm afraid I'm going to cover a little bit of what Karen has already covered in terms of family photographs and some of Alf's sketches. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my father's work, because I sometimes feel he was rather overshadowed by my grandfather, although he produced a lot of windows, more than 200 windows, some of them enormous, like the south transept in Glasgow Cathedral. Of course, if Alf had lived, he would have produced an awful lot of windows too at the rate he was going. But my father was rather different from Alf, and I'll discuss that a little. I'd like to thank also everybody at Glasgow City Heritage Trust for the opportunity to do this, and also I'd like to particularly to thank Gordon Urquhart, who's done so much research on my grandfather, and Linda Cannon, who took most of the photographs which you're looking at of the Cowan window, which was here. Right, this is from the Cowan window. Could I have the next slide, please? Alf, you've seen this one before. My uncle, Cameron, Alf's youngest son, once told me a story that he'd been approached by an elderly woman who said with some astonishment, You're Alf's son, but Alf was such a handsome man. I have to say, my uncle was perfectly good looking, and he was a very funny man, and it was typical of him. He would tell a story against himself like that. Next slide, please. This is Alf's grave, which is at the huge military cemetery designed by Lutjens at Étaples, near Le Touquet. Next slide, please. Right, here you have the family sitting out. My grandfather in the middle was a sporran. Behind him is his brother Edward. On his right is his father George, shipping. He was in shipping, looking a little bit disgruntled. Perhaps he was aware that his son wasn't going to follow him into shipping, or he did for a very brief period. And then on my grandfather's left, his mother, Anne. Next slide, please. This is Maud. It looks like they got married when she was already pregnant with Martin. So she obviously was quite a forceful character. Next slide, please. And this is Alf with his eldest son, Martin, on his shoulder. Next slide, please. And that is Maud with Gordon. You've already seen this photograph. Next slide, please. And this is a slide of them in, I think, in 168 Bath Street, in the studio there. And Alf is sitting in the chair with Gordon between his knees, and Maud sitting beside him with Martin on the floor. This photograph of Maud I'm going to try and enlarge to see whether she also is appearing in some of the windows. Next slide, please. And this is after Alf's death, living in Hallside, I think this is. Martin on the left, Maud in the middle, Cameron at the bottom, and Gordon, my father, with his hands in his pockets. Next, please. I'm going to show you a few little sketches from the only sketchbook we have of Alf's. Next slide, please. This is his mother, I'm pretty sure, and grandma. She lived until 1945. I never met her. And of course, I should make it quite clear that I never met my grandfather either. So he died 24 years before we were born. Next slide, please. This is the slide sketch. There are a couple of sketches of this lady, and I'm not sure. I don't recognize my grandmother from this sketch because my grandmother, when I knew my grandmother, it was some 30 years after, or probably 40 years after this was drawn. Next slide, please. Doesn't really come out very clearly at all. I just thought that was the only photograph, next slide please, that looked remotely like this. But certainly this face is used in a number of the angels. Next slide, please. That one in particular, I think. Next slide, please. And that is Edward, which you've already seen. Next slide. And the sketchbook is full of other studies of family and of drapery and nature, twigs and blossom and other things. Next slide, please. And studies of hands, which he would reuse. And I believe some of Alf's sketches were continued to be used, they're traced over by the studio in the years from his death until my father took over. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. These are some sketches, rather cartoon-like sketches. There are some sketches which look as though they've been done in Europe rather than here in Glasgow. Next slide, please. This is a little sketch, rather marred by the brown crayon, I'm afraid, a rather beautiful sketch of my father, Gordon. And then next slide, please. You've already seen that. And next slide, please. Again, Karen has referred to these being reproduced in the windows. Next slide, please. This is 168 Bath Street, now occupied by a firm of lawyers, but it must have been rather fun with the windows, probably, and sketches displayed in this white painted bay, and the family lived above. Well, I never knew that, but next slide, please. One of the things we have in my house is this little panel of gold mosaic. And I'm just showing this to say that grandfather was interested. He was very experimental. He was not just interested in stained glass windows. He was experimenting with other forms of art, using not just square mosaics, but other shapes and things. Gordon has a word for it, but I can't. Gordon, can you remember what it was called? No, he's here somewhere, but anyway, I can't remember. It's in his book. Next, please. One of the things that Alf did was produced 8 quite large murals for a smoking room in the Byzantine chambers, which in Argyle Street, which is now a completely different building. The building was demolished, and it's now where Debenhams are. This is one of them, really brightly coloured and using gesso and all sorts of other materials to enrich the texture. Next slide, please. It's another one. These are the sketches for the murals. Next, please. And this is a little postcard of what the room was like. And these are these big murals. They're still knocking around. There's one in the Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, and there was another one in Uskibbar in Woodlands Road, but they've redone it now, and I don't know what happened to it. And we had one, certainly, but I'm afraid I don't know what Mother did with it. Mother, I mean, when we lived in, when they had to downsize in the late 1970s, Mother was confronted with a whole huge room full of paper cartoons. And I'm sorry to tell you that she burnt them. She didn't know what to do with it, obviously, and she didn't consult us. So I'm sorry, but I find it difficult to forgive her for that. Next slide, please. This is the Cowan window here, which is undoubtedly, in my view, my grandfather's masterpiece, and I think the last window that he actually did. Next slide, please. Right, I'm now going to talk more about my domestic experience of living with my father's studio, which was integral to our life. He had a pattern of working. He got up quite early, walked the dog, and then would go and work either in the studio, producing sketches and cartoons or cut lines, or else in the glass room where he chose the glass and did the painting on the glass. And he would break off at 10:30 for a cup of coffee, which the rest of the family joined him for about a quarter of an hour, and then he would break off again at lunch, and then again for tea at 4 o'clock for about a quarter of an hour, and then dinner was at 6:45. It was quite strict Victorian sort of regime. And then sometimes he'd work late at night if he was doing sketches and things, and if there was pressure on. And one of the things smells are very evocative, aren't they, of memory and things. And I remember the house being filled with the smell of beeswax, because he used to melt down beeswax in a little saucepan. I wish I had a photograph of the saucepan. It took on quite a distinctive appearance after some time, because the beeswax was recycled. But anyway, the whole house filled with the smell of beeswax, which was really rather a nice smell. And there were a load of other smells. I think my mother would be rather horrified if I described her house as smelly, but it was something that brings back memories. And I think I'll go through chronologically how the windows were produced rather than concentrating on the smells, but I may describe one or two of them. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you a little bit of my father's work, because I don't feel it's fair to talk about his studio and not show you some of his work, which was quite different from his father's. He was probably more interested or felt compelled to treat the glass as a glass window rather than a painting, or and they're much more even texture. It's almost like a weaving with the quarries behind, the diagonal quarries behind, almost having the same weight as the figures themselves. Next slide, please. This is I think one of his very best windows, which is in Dornoch Cathedral. And it has a brilliance of its own. It sparkles in that he's using Norman slab glass and antique glass. Norman slab glass can sometimes be up to an inch thick in the middle and very thin at the edge, so it refracts the light in a certain sort of way. Next slide, please. And you can see here his windows are also full of detail and different things, and a rather wonderful serpent up at the top, which is an example of flashed glass, which I'll tell you about again in a moment. I know some of you know all about stained glass windows, but I'll run through it anyway. Next, please. And here is a window that Father did in University Chapel, Glasgow University Chapel. A couple of windows. Douglas Strawn, who was 8 years older than my grandfather, and who went on to a very distinguished stained glass career, and whom both my grandfather, I believe, certainly, and my father, certainly, were very much influenced by. Now, these two windows are next to the four Strawn windows, and Father used the same composition in the windows that Strawn had in his. And I want to pay that respect to Douglas Strawn, who was certainly one of the most brilliant stained glass artists in Scotland. Next slide, please. I think my father's way of dealing with faces was very different from Alf's. Alf's developed a three-dimensional way of dealing with them, using stippling to model them, and they were actually almost photographic in some ways. And also, Alf was quite interested in producing very different sorts of characters, not the rather bland sort of pre-Raphaelite saints, but people with distinctive human characters. My father reverted perhaps to the more bland is perhaps not the quite word, but more stylized face. This is a woodcut by Eric Gill, and I think Father was influenced by Eric Gill. Next slide, please. Or by Eric Fraser, another woodcut by him. Of course, the other stained glass artist, next slide, please, who was influenced in a similar sort of way, I think, was Willie Wilson, who was a contemporary of my father's. And this is a little window of his, which came from Hindland Church, I think, and now is in Trinity Church. But a lot of you will never see this window because it's in the gentleman's lavatory. I discovered it quite by some surprise when I saw it. Next slide, please. This is my father's window in Glasgow Cathedral, the South Transit window. It is absolutely enormous. There's another set of, it's practically impossible to photograph, there's another set of lights down below. And Father was very interested in heraldry, and he did a lot of heraldic windows, also in Bute Hall in the Glasgow Cathedral. And there's a huge amount of detail here. Albert Richardson, who was on the consulting body at the Glasgow Cathedral, insisted that the tiny little borders here were all represented the tartans of all the regiments in Scotland. And that involved 3 layers of glass, carefully etched to produce the tartan. And as you can imagine, up at the top, completely invisible to everybody who was looking at the window. Next, please. And lastly, I'm just going to show you a couple of little windows in the crypt at Glasgow Cathedral. Do go and see them sometimes. These are the sketches for them. Next, please. These are the windows. Next, please. Which I think represent my father moving towards a slightly more abstract window, very, again, evenly coloured, but very, very rich blues and reds. Next, please. And you can see the sort of stylized angels at the top there. Next, please. Right. That just I wanted to cover some of my father's work. He, as I say, did more than 200 windows all over Scotland and indeed over the world. He's got windows in Chile and South Africa and Singapore and elsewhere. But he actually was reluctant to work overseas because he felt he didn't have quite the same knowledge about the context of the window. This is 5 Newton Terrace. Next slide, please. And you can see here the leaded glass, which is still there, which was presumably put there by my family. Next slide, please. This is a little sketch diagram of how we lived in this house. The Newton Terrace is here, and Sochior Street's here, and Newton Terrace on the south side. Come up the stairs and you would be introduced into the studio if you were a client, where Father did the sketches and cartoons. And on the front was where the windows were, and the glass was actually painted. Down below, very much the workshop, the lead room where Mr. Waddle and Mr. Ingram worked, and the choosing room facing south where Father would choose the glass. And out at the back here was the kiln. Next slide, please. However, in 1952, they moved to Clevedon Crescent. Next slide, please. J.J. Burnett, wonderful crescent. Actually, when they moved there, it wasn't in terribly good shape, and they managed to, I think, buy it for £12,000, which wasn't a lot of money, but it was quite a lot of money at the time. Anyway, a much bigger house. Next slide, please. And here the studio was sort of even more distributed around the house, in that the main entrance was here, the front family drawing room there, where Father had his 11s and tea. Behind that, the glass room, Granny Webster's bedroom up on the first floor, along with my parents' bedroom, and the studio was there. And then on the top were my brother Martin and my bedrooms, along with the store for the cartoons and all that sort of stuff, which Mother burnt. Next slide, please. And this is the main entrance. The brown is where the family lived, and the yellow is the work. I've got the scale slightly wrong here. Because it's a crescent, it's sort of wedge-shaped, so it's quite a lot bigger as you get back. And in this little drawing, I haven't made the lead room quite big enough, but it was next door to the washroom, so you've got the smell of soap in there, along with the smell of hot solder, which mingled with the smell of my mother's soup, which she always had in it. Next slide, please. So this is the basic process which I will go through, the inquiry and phone call or a letter inquiring whether my father would consider making a window. Always a red letter day in the house. Called for a little drink in the evening if it had an inquiry. And then you got the commission when the price was agreed and the subject was agreed. Father would go and visit the church. It took a lot of time and trouble to find which way the window was facing, what the architecture of the church was like. He'd make templates of the tracery. Then he'd produce the sketch. The sketch had to be approved, not only by the donor and the minister and the congregation, but also by the Commission for Artistic Matters in the Church of Scotland, and also it had to have listed building approval. So all that could take quite a lot of time before he was able to start on the full-size cartoon, which was done in charcoal, full-size, and Father had a special series of steps made so he could work up and down to the top of the window and to the bottom, although, of course, as in case of the cathedral, some bits of it had to be rolled up. Emma, my niece, still has that scaffold, that timber scaffold, which she uses for her tapestries. Then came the cut line, where the pattern and design for the lead cams, the H-shaped lead cams that join the bits of glass, were put together. And then he chose the glass, he cut the glass and etched it if necessary. I'll go through this later. And then there were 2 stages of painting with fired in the kiln between that. And then it was leaded, soldered and smudged. I'll tell you about smudging. And then it was fitted and unveiled and dedicated. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's my father at his desk in 10 Cleveland Crescent with a fine view over Glasgow facing south. Next slide, please. This was taken later in his life. That's actually a sketch of Alf's. Next slide, please. This is a sketch of my father's in Woodside Church, which isn't very far from here. It's now called Tesco. It's a different building. The building was being pulled down, but the windows fortunately were saved and now are at Stamperland. But what I want to draw your attention to is the care that Father took to draw the architecture of the window. And in fact, there was a balcony above, and there were murals in this building too. Next slide, please. Just a quick photograph of the actual windows by my father, which were Alf's memorial. These windows were done in memorial to his father. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is the full-size charcoal cartoon, which introduced another smell, actually. It was, my father, he had made up a little mixture of shellac and methylated spirits, and he used to spray it over the charcoal to fix it. And it had a very sort of sharp smell. Didn't last very long, although my father smelt of it for quite some time. Next slide, please. The cartoon's been put on a table here. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. This is the cut line. Basically what happens here is that a thin card is put on top of the large table. The carbon paper is put on top of that. The cartoon is put on top of that. And then a linen tracing paper is put on top of that. And on the linen tracing paper, Father designed the cut line. So you don't want a bit of lead going through somebody's face. And also the actual, as you can see, the design of the lead itself has a separate quality of its own. And then after that, next slide, please. The card at the bottom is marked with all the shapes of glass, and that is cut with a rather special pair of scissors, which removed a little strip around the edge of all the pieces of card, the templates. And that accommodates the thickness of the lead cans. So there was a tolerance automatically introduced. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Father got the glass from Hetley's in London, who were agents for glass, or directly from Hartley Wood in Sutherland. Next slide, please. And this is, sorry about the rather fuzzy quality of this, but this photograph was taken about 25 years ago in the choosing room, in the glass room at 10 Cleveland Crescent. And it shows the enormous amount of glass, some of the glass that he had all around him. All of these slots were contained antique glass, which was blown like a long big sausage and then opened out, or the smaller bits contained Norman glass, Norman slab, which was blown into a little box, and then the sides were broken out. Next slide, please. That's a piece of Norman slab where the sides hasn't been broken out, and I think I've mentioned before, this sort of glass gives you the difference of thickness, which reflects the light and adds a sparkle to the windows. Next slide, please. And grandfather introduced the use of these little bits of cast glass, which my father used as well. We called them jewels. When we were infants, we used to be given these jewels to play with. Next slide, please. And that's Father in the choosing room. And what you can see here is a flat plate glass, so quite thick, almost more than about 3/8 of an inch thick plate glass, onto which the cut glass, Hugh Ingram, who worked with Father all his life, would cut the glass from the templates where Father had chosen it. Father would take all the little separate templates in card and mark them with chalk on the bit of glass that he wanted it used, and the specific part of that bit of glass that he wanted to be used, because it wasn't evenly coloured. And the glass would be cut and numbered, and each template would be numbered. And then there was a sort of enormous jigsaw trying to put the bit of glass in the right place on this plate glass, the underneath of which the lead lines had been painted in lamp black. So once that had been done, and the entire family used to come and do this because it was a very tedious procedure. I'm terribly good at jigsaw puzzles now. That was then stuck with this beeswax, which filled the house. It was rather good. Next slide, please. And this is an etching technique which my grandfather was very interested in, and so was my father. Next slide, please. This is a little sketch by my grandfather. I can't find which window this is for, but you can see at the top, he says, ruby slab bitten. Bitten means it's been etched away by hydrofluoric acid. So it was a red flashed glass, and flashed glass has a thin skin of colour on top of plain glass, all fused together. And it's just very even colour. And here down at the bottom, an emerald green bit of glass, which he's had bitten again. It's been etched away. So what they did was they had the bit of glass, they'd paint the bits they didn't want to be bitten away, in other words, it was going to retain the colour, with wax, hot wax, which is another smell. And then it would go into a little basin of hydrochloric acid, and it sat there for a day or two next to my mother's soup. Health and safety were one of the main concerns of my family. Next slide, please. And yes, we can see Alf using this. Next slide, please. In the Cowan window. Here you can see a piece of what was blue flashed glass, and they've etched away the white to make the patterns. And if you remember that window that I showed of my father's at Dornoch, the serpent's head, that would be 3 bits together because there was both red, blue, and white in that. And next slide, please. Firing. Well, the first thing that Father would do after the glass had been stuck down onto the plate glass was he would take the main features and the main bits of drapery and the faces and things, and he would trace them over the cartoon. And then those would be separately fired. And then after they'd been fired, they'd come back, and then he would do the stippling of the contour of the glass, depending on whether the window was facing south or north. The amount of stippling to bring out the character and 3-dimension qualities of the glass would be different. Firing it, each piece of glass was put on a small railway carriage filled with dry plaster of Paris. And this was out in the backyard. So every bit was on this, and then the railway carriage would be trundled into this big oven, which had a huge steel door, which was then closed. And down each side of it, there were 3 or 4 valves. It was a gas-fired kiln. And Father would squeeze, because it was a very tight space, in between the outside wall and the kiln itself, and turn on these valves, one side, and then he'd rush round and turn on the valves on the other side, by which time the kiln itself had filled with gas, actually, and he would open a little slot in the door and push in a burning piece of newspaper, at which point there was a considerable explosion. And we could hear it all through the house, a huge thump, And father would emerge in the kitchen with his slightly singed eyebrows and say, "The kiln is on," with some relief. Next slide, please. And then the next stage was leading and soldering. Next slide, please. This is Hugh Ingram. Hugh Ingram was father's only assistant after Mr. Waddell, who had worked for Alf as well, died. And the only other assistant that father had was Neil Hutchison, who worked with father in the studio for a few years, and unfortunately died rather young. Next slide, please. This is Hugh soldering the glass together with putting tallow on the lead to help it stick, and then the solder, you can see the rod of solder there. The tallow also mingled with the kitchen smells. Next slide. Oh, well, no, sorry. Okay. I haven't got a photograph of this, but smudging was quite an stuff. There was whiting and coal dust and a bit of putty and sawdust all mixed together to make this mastic, traditional mastic, which was scrubbed onto the windows. The windows formed, perhaps we could go back a slide. The windows are formed into about 2 foot or 1'6" panels supported by iron rods, and every 2 panels supported by aluminium rods, which are built into the stone mullions of the window. It's quite interesting, the Cowan window, when Linda Cannon dismantled the Cowan window, we discovered that these rods, which are there for structural reasons because windows are very heavy, weren't actually built into the stone mullions at all, which is the reason why the window was buckling and why it was, in fact, had to be taken down before it collapsed. So that's rather an important thing. And once the smudging and everything had been completed, next slide, please. The window was assembled, the panels of the window were loaded into the boot of my father's car and driven off to Aberdeen or wherever he had to go to fit it. It was fitted by Hugh Ingram, my father, and William McPhee, who was a lovely joiner, a great friend of my father. And then it was either unveiled if it was, we had a lot of blue cloth which he would fix up over the window if it wasn't too large, and the donor would then be able to do this sort of Her Majesty's thing of pulling a cord and dropping the rails. Sometimes these donors, who were giving a window in memory of their late husband or something, were quite elderly. I remember one occasion when the old lady who my father and mother had picked up in their car to take to the church for the unveiling said, "I don't watch this, I feel terribly uncomfortable this morning." And my mother had to discreetly remove the coat hanger behind her, her fur coat. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And that's the little signature of my grandfather's. Next slide, please. And that's another one. I don't know where this came from. It obviously got broken. An earlier one. Next slide, please. And that's my father's quite fairly discreet signature. That's in this church here, that one. Next slide, please. And that's it up. Next slide, please. Thanks very much.